Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, January 23rd, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about, as you can tell from the title of this video, how David Perdue is continuing to make himself the unelectable GOP candidate for the 2022 gubernatorial race. And I'll show you exactly what I mean by that. David Perdue entered into the race announcing that he will challenge the Republican incumbent governor, Brian Kemp, someone who was very well known during the 2020 election because of his refusal to overturn the election results despite being a Trump-backed candidate all the way back from 2018. In fact, David Perdue entering into this bid is very similar to how Brian Kemp entered in, challenging Casey Cagle, the incumbent lieutenant governor at the time, for a bid that was meant to be going in a different direction. This was a race in which Donald Trump's endorsement in 2018 made all the difference by the time the runoff election came around. In fact, I can show you a bit of the politics behind it and a bit of the history behind it because it does tell you a very similar story of what we can expect to see today. Because when you go to the Georgia governor election from 2018, the first round of votes here, you found that Casey Cagle, as the current, actually, I do not know exactly what percentage he was expected to get in the runoff election before the Trump endorsement. But what you found here was that there were two main candidates. While you had state senators, you had executives, you had the lieutenant governor and the secretary of state. Two people who are closely working with the president, with the governor of the state, and know them well, and are statewide elected officials. The Secretary of State election is not a regular type of appointment that you would see on the presidential level with their cabinet. No, this is an elected position that you run for. So both Brian Kemp and Casey Cagle had some type of electoral history across the state. And in looking at these endorsements, Casey Cagle received the most of them. He received Nathan Deal, who was the incumbent governor of Georgia at that time. Makes sense. That's his lieutenant governor. You had Saxy Chambliss, a former United States senator, a very well-known one. You had 4 representatives and a bunch of state senators. So in the first primary, Casey Cagle received nearly 40% of the vote and 236,000 votes. Brian Kemp only received just 26% of the vote. And by the time the runoff election came around, it was in a position where Casey Cagle was meant to win. He was up by a considerable amount at one point of 10 percentage points, and it narrowed down as it got closer, but then President Trump made a decision. President Trump made an endorsement for Brian Kemp, saying that he should be the nominee for the state of Georgia for the governorship. And what happened was Casey Cagle, instead of holding on to the 236,000 votes that he received before, and the 40%, he only received 31% of the vote and 179,000 votes in this primary. So you can see the impact, the clear impact of a Trump endorsement in the state of Georgia, especially amongst the Republican Party. And as we go into 2022, Brian Kemp and David Perdue are now here to face off against each other, but Donald Trump has already endorsed David Perdue, despite him not being the incumbent. So David Perdue already starts out as the outsider in this race. He starts out not necessarily as a political outsider, but more so as the one who is trying to get into this race by challenging an incumbent governor. But he has gone so far to the right that it makes him, in essence, unelectable, while making himself electable for the primary. And there's a fine line that is, constantly treaded upon by these Republican candidates, enough so that they are appeasing the Trump base with this election rhetoric and these election lies. And then they are also making themselves electable in the general election. But what David Perdue here is he's doing too much of this and not enough of this. He's spending way too much time trying to win over the solid Republican base there on the Republican primary that doesn't believe the election was legitimate, that doesn't believe Joe Biden is the fairly installed 46th president, and doesn't believe that David Perdue fairly lost the Senate runoff elections. He's trying to appease them at the expense of pushing away independent, right-leaning voters that pushed away from David Perdue when he used this type of rhetoric in the Georgia runoff elections. And now, instead of trying to backtrack and move towards the center, as you typically see when candidates go a little too extreme, when you take any circumstance from presidential elections or Senate elections where candidates do so much to win over their core base, they always have to walk it back. It's something that is understood as standard political convention. When you see Joe Biden and you see Bernie Sanders and you see Hillary Clinton, all of them overpromised in the Democratic primary. They were trying to win Democratic voters. Well, when you have to pivot to a general election in a swing state like Georgia, you typically walk it back. David Perdue failed to walk it back in the Georgia runoff elections, and he lost, and now he's back to lose again by using this type of rhetoric. he has a chance at victory, but he doesn't make it easy for himself when he continues to push this election rhetoric. In fact, he goes so far saying that he is now calling on a new election police unit, despite there being no clear evidence of widespread or any monumental voter fraud in the 2020 election or 2021 runoff election that both Donald Trump fairly lost in November and David Perdue fairly lost in January. And that's where the concern is here. You see, I'm seeing this from someone who is trying to put an analytical, viewpoint on what David Perdue is trying to do. And I think it is very clear that on one case, he is trying to win over the Trump Republican base, but this isn't the rhetoric that you need to win the general election. The problem is these elections and these primaries are going to be held so close to the general election that it won't be enough time to pivot. And even if he tries to pivot today, it's going to be hard when you have these things tracking behind you, saying that what happened in 2020 should never happen again. Sure, maybe a Republican might say that about a Democrat winning in your state, but that's not what he's referring to. He's referring to the fact that supposedly Brian Kemp caved to Stacey Abrams, which we all know simply isn't true. Brian Kemp hates Stacey Abrams and definitely fears her, but not enough to say you take control of the election process. Stacey Abrams wasn't even in office in order to oversee any type of these elections. But he says that Brian Kemp caved to Stacey Abrams before the November election and weakened our election standards. Who knows what he's referring to by that? Then, when Jorgensen had legitimate questions about the November election, Kemp refused to investigate or fix problems before the January runoff. Essentially, he is blaming Brian Kemp for the Democrats winning in the state of Georgia. But it is so insane to me. I mean, you can see just how weird it is to relitigate an election that you lost yourself. I mean, if anything, it's embarrassing. And I think that this really goes to show that this election rhetoric is not going to be given up. And it's something that did not work in 2021. Even Jack Ciattarelli and the New Jersey GOP nominee and Glenn Youngkin. More so Glenn Youngkin than Ciattarelli. Ciattarelli did dabble into a bit of it, but more so for the example of Glenn Youngkin, because he's the one who actually won, right? He didn't say that Virginia's election was stolen. He didn't say, Donald Trump fairly won the 2020 election and it was stolen by Joe Biden. And because that's something that wouldn't work in a state as blue as Virginia. Now, Georgia isn't nearly as blue, but you have a very similar voting group here that pushed away from President Trump in a monumental way. When you take a look at the shifts between presidential elections between Georgia and Virginia from 2012 to 2020, what you will find is that Virginia shifted by 6 and Georgia shifted by 8. They shifted by similar amounts, not because they adore Joe Biden, but more so because they did not like President Trump. When you take a look at the shift from, 2012 to 2016, again, the election difference here, Romney versus Trump on the ballot. And despite Trump winning the election, whereas Romney did not, almost every state shifted towards the right amongst the monumental ones, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Iowa, Florida, North Carolina, right? What you found in Virginia and Georgia is that Georgia shifted by 2.7 and Virginia shifted by 1.5. So while Georgia isn't as blue as Virginia, the shifts relative and in a response to President Trump were very similar. And that's why this is not an electable strategy. I don't think I should have to educate or advise Republicans to say that an election that you lost fairly is not going to be a state that you want to return and say this was not a free and fair election. When there are voters in the state of Georgia that voted for a Democrat for the first time since '92, and that Democrat being Joe Biden, and all of a sudden you have the top Republican officials from the White House and the United States Congress saying, no, that wasn't a fair election. In fact, Donald Trump won your state in a landslide. These are the things you don't want to hear as a swing voter. These are things you don't want to see as someone who is hesitant about voting for the GOP, but reluctantly did so. Because there were voters that voted for Trump in 2020 that voted for Democrats in 2021. There are voters that were surveyed. There are voters that were, put out on mainstream media. In fact, I remember on election night, I don't know how many of you guys were watching closely on CNN's election coverage before I live streamed the election, but they interviewed some voters. And one voter had said that they voted for Brian Kemp. They voted for David Perdue, and they had voted for Kelly Loeffler in November. They said that, they were voting for Republicans. They had been a lifelong Republican voter, but they were hesitant about Trump. But they didn't see Loeffler or David Perdue in a similar light. Well, then after they began to jump on this election rhetoric, they voted for Democrats that day. It very much sounded like this person was pushing away from the GOP because of these election lies, these election pieces of rhetoric that completely remove trust in our election process. It is not a partisan statement to say that the election was fair. It is not a partisan statement to say that the election was not rigged. And as much as, people try to argue that it was, even citing that some of the election rules had changed, look at who changed them. When they cite the fact that Pennsylvania saw a change in election rules right before the election, it wasn't Democrats that did that. In fact, it was an effort put by and for the GOP that backfired tremendously and gave Democrats the upper hand. I mean, to say that that is a rigging of the election, first of all, is not what is being argued, but it isn't even really that defensible when it comes down to the point of Democrats did this. If anything, if anyone is responsible for any of those election laws changing right before the election, it is the GOP. Because look at who is in control of those states, look at who is in control of the state legislatures, and look at exactly who proposed it. You will find that Republicans were their own, to their own detriment in most of those cases. In fact, almost all of them. But again, the point here is, not about me trying to say that the election was not rigged, but rather that voters are going to reject this police force, this extremist tactic that he is taking towards this scenario. I mean, David Perdue, I think, is a very smart politician. He has the means to win. I simply don't know why he's doing this. As someone who views it from a nonpartisan standpoint or tries to, this pains me to see that someone who very clearly could win the general election is making it so hard for them to do so. I mean, I am not going to deny the fact that 2022 probably won't be a year that Democrats are going to enjoy. In fact, I have made it very clear on many occasions since the beginning of this year that the Republican Party will win back control of the House of Representatives, and at this point is very likely to win back control of the Senate. But nothing is a done deal. And these governor elections are the least impactful by way of election years, which puts it in a position where Democrats have a better shot at Georgia's governor election than they might in the Senate election. But that's up for debate and deliberation. But my point is that all of these races, because of the national environment, are absolutely winnable, especially with an incumbent already in this race. And seeing David Perdue really crack down and try to push this election rhetoric again means that this argument against Stacey Abrams isn't going to fit anymore. When Donald Trump attacked Stacey Abrams for not conceding in the 2018 governor's race, saying that this is very similar to what he was doing, he was pushed back by Democrats, but there wasn't really that much you could say in terms of the difference there. I have seen both of their non-concessions, and I do think that Stacey Abrams was one who didn't go so far as to delegitimize every election following suit. But it wasn't a good look for the Democratic Party to, on one hand, criticize President Trump and then not have Stacey Abrams submit additional information or statements on such a topic. But again, I'm not going to be advising the Georgia Democratic Party on what they should or shouldn't have done. But what I am going to say is that this argument against Stacey Abrams falls apart the minute that David Perdue says things like this, and has already fallen apart, enough so that it can't be utilized. You cannot criticize someone for doing exactly what you are doing. That's why if Stacey Abrams was to come out and say that this is the only argument she has against the GOP winning again, that wouldn't work. But the good news for the Democratic Party is that they have a bigger platform than just going against this election rhetoric. They had a bigger platform when they went into the Georgia runoff elections. And seeing the fact that the Georgia runoff shifted the state further towards the left and the state's continued increased growth around the Atlanta metro area, which constitutes the majority of the state's population and voting groups, you find that the Democratic Party is more positioned, at least on a completely even standpoint in the national environment now than they were a year ago, or than they were in the November general election. Disregarding the Biden approval, disregarding everything else, if all was even, if Biden was 50-50 in approval, and, we were referencing the 2020 election, or at least he was there where he was in the 2020 election, Democrats are in a better position now than they were a year and a half ago. But that doesn't always mean you're going to win, because if the national environment is 13 points more right-wing than where it was back in 2020 or 2018, the national environment does tend to overcome some type of increase in voting population. And while Republicans won't have a landslide victory, they could still very well have a victory. And so could David Perdue. But he just makes it so much harder for himself as time goes on. I think what we are going to see after this primary, which is expected to take place, let me go ahead and check. I'm not entirely sure. I thought I did end up knowing. But the point is that once this primary takes place, what I do expect to see, I do expect that we are going to find David Perdue or Brian Kemp shift themselves towards the center. The state of Georgia is not a state that can be won on radical ideology or, completely left wing or right wing stances. That's why John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock had to take many centrist positions to be elected. Who knows if they're going to follow through with them? The same thing is going to have to happen for Brian Kemp and David Perdue. They're going to have to walk back their add-ons to what they believe, from the 2020 election. Brian Kemp probably won't be as bad in that case, in terms of promoting different things, but David Perdue very well might. I think that at this point, he sees this as his means to an end when it came down to the primary. If he wins this primary, it will be on the back of many of these claims. And as, unfortunate as it is for his political party, might end up sticking through it through the general election. But that probably won't help him. And it hasn't helped Georgia Republicans when they did it in early 2021. And I can't imagine it would benefit them in 2022, 2 years after the election, relitigating an election that there have been so many audits, so many investigations, so much concerted interest in the race, and you cannot find any clear evidence of voter fraud. That's where it gets tricky. And that's where the voters turn on you. And they already have. Taking a look at the approval over states such as Arizona, over the Arizona audit, with 55% of their states saying, stop the audit, it's useless, the election is over. When you have states such as Georgia that already rejected Trump-like candidates like Loeffler, like Perdue, even though they may have been incumbents, they were saying, we don't want you anymore. Those are the things that I think the Democratic Party is going to take advantage of. The fact that they have used the strategy against the GOP, and the GOP has done this to their own detriment, and they are gearing themselves up to do it again right in 2022. The national environment will be very different if David Perdue decides to follow through with this idea that the 2020 election was rigged and tries to, push this election force, whatever it might be. He could still very much win simply because the national environment is so bad for the Democratic Party, but it makes it very difficult to do so. And Stacey Abrams is not one to go down without a fight, as Georgia Republicans now know very, very well. So to continue this, I think, is just naive. I think it's a very bad decision on the GOP side when it comes down to the state of Georgia. But David Perdue is his own person, and he is fully within his rights to say anything that he wants to. But the voters here are also fully within their rights to reject him once the November ballot comes around. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.